anyway, yeah, any questions you have, put them in there. Kenny, take it away. You've got 35 minutes. 35 minutes, we'll say. Go ahead.
Great. Excellent. Thanks, everybody, for joining. My name is Kenny Blumenfeld. I work in the Minnesota Climate Office. We're part of the Department of Natural Resources, full-time employees here, and I'm honored to be doing this webinar. So thanks. We're going to talk about what's been going on with the climate in essentially the north central U.S. I guess it's a little bit of housekeeping first. You can get the recorded webinars from this and other monthly webinars from either of the two regional climate centers that serve this area. So that would be the Midwest region or the High Plains region. The next one will be Thursday, December 19th at 1 p.m. That's with Bridget Mason from the Wisconsin State Climate Office. Here's what we're going to talk about today. This is kind of a minimalist. There's a lot more we could talk about. This is, we've been in kind of an interesting pattern, but we're going to cover the recent temperature and precipitation. We're going to cover some major events of note. Interestingly, as you'll see, there really weren't that many. We had kind of a long-term climate event for most of September and then into October. And then as we got into November, things have gotten interesting, but that left us with not that many specific events to talk about, somewhat different from what we had, say, much earlier in the summer when it was one event after another. We'll discuss some of the impacts, then we'll look at drought conditions and some of the hydrological conditions, and then talk about some of the concerns that you may have going into the coming season, and take a look at the outlook, and then have some additional resources you can go to at the end, and we'll take your questions at that time. So let's begin. The key themes that kind of your take-home points, and I apologize if any of these photos aren't credited. Some of them are actually stock photos because we have a Microsoft account here at the DNR, and I tried to credit all the ones that came in from other climatologists. So we've had a warm and dry October. That's essentially the main theme for October, is that it was warm and dry. We had expanding drought right up until the end, where some pretty interesting things started happening. And then especially as we got into November, we saw some big changes across the region. In general, October was not as extreme as September. Those of you who attended the last webinar, Austin did a great job, but you may recall we didn't have final data from September because of some of the delays related to the remnants of Hurricane Helene coming in and affecting the National Centers for Environmental Information in Asheville. So I'm not going to overlap too much with what Austin did, but I am going to show you a couple of the maps of temperature and precipitation patterns in the region for September, and then we'll also look at the combined effects of September and October, since it kind of was almost like a 2-month event that we've had here over much of the region. Now that we're about 2/3 of the way through November, by and large, it's been warm and wet. There's been some exceptions, a little bit cooler in kind of the western parts of the region. The impacts have included, from the dry weather, we've had fire, a lot of agricultural fire. We've had some isolated flooding from heavy precipitation. Most of that's been more recent. And we've also had some unusual plant activity, essentially think really delayed fall colors, kind of muted fall colors in some areas, but especially a lot of reports across the region, especially the areas that were warm, of second blooms. The near-term outlook is basically cool and wet over much of the region, and the winter outlook still favors La Niña development. So we'll look at all of that as we go through the information that we have here. So let's look at the September and October temperature and precipitation patterns. And again, generally it was warm and dry both months. September was both the warmest and the driest at some locations. So those were the final numbers that Austin didn't have access to with last month's webinar. October really continued that pattern, but because there were some changes, especially towards the end of the month, it ended up uniformly warm and dry, but not quite as extreme. So here are the final September temperature ranks. Basically, if you see red, and remember, we're looking at basically Montana down to Colorado, over to Ohio, and up to Michigan. So that's kind of the north central region that we're looking at here. So those red states, or where you see it says 130th, that's actually just kind of the way that NCEI, the National Centers for Environmental Information, does their rankings, but it actually indicates it's the warmest. So in the Dakotas and Minnesota and Wyoming, we had the warmest September on record. But you also see that a lot of the other states in the region were in the top 10. And the anomalies basically ranged from about 1.7 degrees Fahrenheit to 8.5 degrees Fahrenheit, above the historical average. So in these maps, in their companion maps where they actually show the temperature departure, it's from 20th century averages, a little different from what you might have heard as normal, but it's more of a long-term historical average. So in any case, it was basically warm September to extremely warm September across the region, with most of those extremes kind of in the northern part of the area. When we look at October, no states in our region were warmest on record, but I mean, you had a lot of the region in top 10, and all of the states in the region were in the top 25. So we've got 130 years on record here. And so what we're saying is averaged across these states, and you're going to get local variations within some of the states. Some of the climate divisions or even smaller geographical areas may have actually been more extreme than what's shown, or less extreme than what's shown on the map. But across the region, everyone was in the top 25 out of 130 years. So that's basically the upper fifth or so. And as you can see, a lot of the region was in the top 10. So really above the 90th percentile. So quite warm. In that sense, it's warmer than 9 out of 10 Octobers at least. Here, the anomalies ranged from 2.9 degrees in Kentucky to 6.4 degrees in Minnesota and Wyoming. Again, those are above the historical average. One note on anomalies is as you move from summer to winter, you have more variation in temperatures. It's just kind of part of the typical climate of this region. So, a 6-degree anomaly in October isn't quite as impressive as a 6-degree departure in September, but it's still pretty significant. And as you can see, it's good enough to get a rather high ranking in a lot of these instances. So when we put September and October together, so look at the average over each of these areas over that 2-month period, what you see is that basically in the northern parts of the region, Montana, Wyoming, the north and west essentially, we were record or near record warmth for that 2-month period. I mean, it was incredibly warm in September, and then it was very warm in October. So no surprise that a lot of areas ended up way up there, either ranked number 1, number 2, and really in the region, only the southern, kind of southeastern parts of the region, so that would be Missouri and Indiana and Kentucky, only those states really weren't in the top 10. And they were close, right? They weren't that far off. So it was a very warm, basically first part, middle part of fall here in the north central region. Now, going back to the September's precipitation, we mentioned it was also quite dry. And again, these are statewide ranks, but remember that individual parts of states, whether you're looking at climate divisions or if you're looking at counties or even individual stations, some areas are going to be more extreme than what's represented on the map. So you see that Iowa and Nebraska on a statewide basis were both the driest September on record. And then you see, Minnesota ranked 3rd and some other, Michigan also. Most states were dry to very dry. When you when you combine that dryness with the warmth, it really is an unusual combination. And we'll look at that in a moment. A couple exceptions that are worth noting, and again, Austin hinted at some of this in the last webinar. He actually went into some detail about it. The one is that Montana had been kind of a wet period. Parts of the West had decent precipitation. There takes a little less precipitation in some of those areas to kind of hit normal, but they got it. And so they were actually more on the wet side in Montana. And if you look at Kentucky, they're way up there for wetness. And that's, of course, because you had moisture coming in from Hurricane Helene, really soaking parts of that region. So the anomalies for September precipitation, when the final numbers came in, they ended up very close to -3 inches in Iowa. And that's an awful lot of the average September precipitation right there. It means that Iowa missed most of its September precipitation. And then you had positive anomalies or departures from the historical averages in Kentucky of almost 3 inches. So almost the same amount of departure because they had so much extra precipitation coming from that tropical weather system. When we look at October, again, it was actually uniformly dry. It just wasn't quite as extreme. It didn't have the localized extremes of dryness. And this is really because some of the things that were happening towards the end of the month. One of the details we aren't going to show, but kind of worth pointing out is a lot of us were really dry for the first 30 days of the month. This was, and in Iowa, for example, the state climatologist reports that some stations had basically driest on record right up to the last day, but then got soaked, and then 1 to 2.5 inches of rain fell, and so that dropped the kind of statewide ranking for dryness down a bit. So there's always something else behind the data, but you had a lot of top 10 dryness for October in Illinois, Indiana, Kentucky, and Ohio, and again, this time there was no tropical weather system throwing any part of the region into the positive precipitation departure category. So you ended up with anomalies that were all negative in all states, with the lowest anomaly being about 2/3 of an inch in Wisconsin and just over 2.5 inches in Kentucky. So Kentucky actually went from a very wet time in September to a very dry time. I don't know, not quite a worst to first or first to worst, but pretty close. Big swing from one month to the next. So then when you put it together and look at, okay, what was this 2-month period like? Obviously, not surprising, a lot of the states ended up in the top 10 for dryness. About half of the states. So it ended up being a very dry period. And if you combine the temperatures and the precipitation, this was sent to us by Eric Hunt from Nebraska. But look at this. If I can kind of walk you through interpreting the image on the right here, you're looking at quadrants. So, and mercifully, this has been labeled. But so in the upper right quadrant, relative to historical averages, you have warm and wet conditions. In the upper left quadrant, you have warm and dry, and then you've got cool and dry lower left and cool and wet lower right. And I had to draw a bright line to the star in the far upper left there because, previously this almost would have been off the charts. No September through October in the Corn Belt was as warm and as dry as this one. And it really stood out by a lot. There's a lot of distance, both as you go from right to left and as you go from top to bottom on this graph between that star that you see in the upper left and the rest of the dots. So September, October in the Corn Belt was quite warm and quite dry. And if you're wondering what the Corn Belt is in this particular definition, I pulled out a map that's kind of the baseline geographic region that's used for these calculations. And it includes most of the region that you're expecting, basically from eastern Ohio into Nebraska and South Dakota and even eastern Colorado. There is that little chunk of southeastern Pennsylvania that's at least contributing a tiny bit to these calculations, but as you can see, it was, dominated by, kind of what the classic Midwestern region and what most people think of when they think of the Corn Belt. So now if we look at what's happened in November, the temperature and precipitation, and this is something Bridget will touch on this and cover this in much more depth with next month's webinar, but it's, we always want to think of the weather we've been experiencing recently, and it really has continued to be warm over much of the region, but it's been a big difference. Much wetter. We've had continued dryness, especially in the far western areas, but most areas have been a lot wetter than they were in September and October. So that's a big difference. And we'll see what the results of that were when we look at kind of the drought conditions. So let's start with temperature here. Temperatures from, and this goes right up through, this goes up through yesterday. So the temperatures, this is just a standard average temperature map. So what you can see is average temperatures over most of the region have been, going from 35 in Montana, North Dakota, northern Minnesota, to the 50s, basically, when you get down into southern parts of Missouri, Illinois, Indiana, Kentucky, and even far southern Ohio. Not a big surprise. That's kind of the normal climatological gradient, but you want to compare that to what's normal, and that there's a normal gradient going from from north to south across the region. Of course, the mountainous regions have been basically below freezing for most of the month. No surprise there. When you look at the map on the right, that's actually the temperature departure from normal. And what you see is these across the region, especially the eastern 3/4 or so, maybe even 80% of the region or more, have been warm, basically through Montana all the way to Ohio. All of these are warm departures, meaning the first 20 days of November were warm, and in some cases, very warm. You do see in those greens and some blues, but generally cooler anomalies in Colorado and southern Wyoming. They've had different air masses coming in. They've had more wintry conditions with some snowfall, and they've been able to pull in more cold air. So that's the one kind of regional exception here, is that, and it's not unusually cool, but some of the anomalies are a little bit steep for that 20-day period. But bigger story is look at the reds. Pretty much anywhere that you see a red, you see it in northern Minnesota and parts of North Dakota, and then down in Kentucky. These are all going to be, if you at least at or near record levels for warmth for the month to date. That means if the month were to end now, you probably have records. But, this is the Midwest. We're kind of known for some changes. And so I think some of those records might be in question as we get into the latter part of the month. More on that in a moment. In terms of precipitation, well, this is where the big changes come in. I mean, unless you're in the Western Dakotas, where it's continued to be very dry, and into Montana, Wyoming, and Western Colorado, those areas have all been pretty dry. But the majority of the region, from the Central Dakotas, basically on east, have been either wet or very wet, with some slight exceptions. And I can just tell you there's a little red blip in northwest Minnesota. That's probably a station error from a station that either wasn't reporting or had some bad data. That we've been either near normal or very wet for most of the state for this month so far. And and then in eastern parts of the region, down towards Ohio and Michigan, maybe a little bit closer to normal precipitation, but kind of leaning wet in any case. And if you look at those, these are percent of normal precipitation we're showing on the right. Some of those are huge departures. I mean, at 20-day periods, 2/3 of a month. So you've got parts of Kansas that are, coming in several times more precipitation than they would normally get this time of year. And you can see again from on the left, that's with, anywhere from say 3 to 6 inches of precipitation. So big change. I mean, we had in many areas more precipitation in the first 20 days of November than we had in September and October, which are climatologically wetter months, but then we had in September and October combined. So big switch in a lot of these areas. So when we look at some of the events driving, the patterns that we're seeing on these maps and the impacts, here we'll only talk about things that happened in October and November. And really it's mostly a November deal here. We had a lot of precipitating weather systems come in since late October, with rainfall extremes in southern areas, what this Colorado state climatologist referred to as a whopper snowstorm. And then additional heavy rain also in the Ohio River area. Again, we're not going to be able to get at every event because there were several of them, but we're going to highlight a couple of the big ones here that really mattered. So we'll start with heavy rain in Kansas, Missouri, and Illinois from November 2 through 5. And again, we really started seeing a shift towards wetter conditions during the end of October. It wasn't realized everywhere across the region. And as you saw, it wasn't enough to pull October into the wetter part of the distribution or to stop October from being dry. But it was, kind of the precursor to a much wetter period that is making some parts of the area extraordinarily wet in November. So this first map, I know it's busy and you probably have to squint. You're looking at this, it's basically centered on Missouri, and this came out of the St. Louis, Missouri National Weather Service office. This was part of basically a weather story and an event write-up that they had following a huge multi-day rainfall event. So again, this is an area that, they are one of the wetter parts of the region, but they got 4 to 10 inches commonly. And really, if you look in that red area that extends southwestward from St. Louis and even northeastward from St. Louis, a lot of that is, 5, 6, 8, 9 inches of rain. So there were even some higher amounts. There's a new 2-day statewide precipitation record for November of 12.5 inches. The old record had been 9.74. So for this time of year, even though, Missouri's no stranger to extremely heavy precipitation, but in November, as a November weather system goes, this really produced an awful lot of precipitation. And the Missouri state climatologist thinks, we'll have to wait till the final numbers come in, but could be heading for the wettest November on record in Missouri. And that on a statewide basis is something to accomplish, given that there's still 10 days of the month left. And even going west, kind of off the map here, the same period produced very heavy precipitation in Kansas, where the 2 to 6 inches were common and some isolated higher amounts. And the Kansas state climatologist reporting that records have been set, multiple, daily records at stations, especially in southern and eastern Kansas, and then also all-time daily precipitation records for the month of November. So really quite an extraordinary event. And I'm just pointed out here, this wasn't the only heavy precipitation event. There was actually a couple other ones just during November, including one near the Ohio River, kind of along the Kentucky, Indiana, Ohio borders, more recently in the last week or so. So this event centered on the St. Louis area or near the St. Louis area produced flooding. There were actually multiple fatalities in Missouri. And that actually included kind of a headline grabbing event that produced fatalities on election day, or right before election day, affecting poll workers. So it's a high impact event. And this is really, for all the events in the region, going back to September or going back to October anyway, this is probably one of the highest impact because A, it's quite extraordinary in its own right, and B, there really had been a lack of these types of events, for the majority of October. So this is kind of where the hydroclimate got down to business. And related. I mean, these are all kind of part of the same system or systems. Big extratropical cyclone that formed in Colorado and produced some very heavy snows. And there was a high water content of these snows. There's a link to the story that the Colorado state climatologist put together, calling this a whopper of a storm. You could see from the map that the Weather Service put together, snowfall was extremely high, kind of in areas that you'd expect in the mountains, but also in the lower terrain. And these are some of the heaviest snows reported in the low terrain at lower elevations in Colorado on record. Not necessarily records, but up at the top. So this is quite a storm, and it produced an awful lot of precipitation. So that lower image is the month-to-date precipitation. Actually, it's about a week old now. But what you see is 3 to 5 inches of precipitation over much of eastern and southeastern Colorado, and really the eastern half of the state almost, getting over 1.5 inches. And then if you swing your head over to the image on the right, you can see this is a very clever map, and it shows how much this November precipitation actually, what proportion of total precipitation from November through February this event accounts for. And it's impressive. Basically, in a period of about a week, much of eastern Colorado got it, not just a whole season's worth, but 4 months worth of precipitation, or in some cases more than 2 to 3 times that 4-month total. So an awful lot of precipitation generated by this event, and it's again related to the weather systems that then affected the St. Louis area during roughly the same period. There are some other impacts in the region, and again, we did have a lot of wildfires in some of the northern forest areas where vegetation goes dormant or dies generally after mid-September, and by late September and October. The dry conditions were really concerning, and we were actually expecting maybe a worse fire season than we got. It appears that we may have been buffered or protected a little bit by the very wet spring and summer that we had, because these were some of the, as you saw from the September and October precipitation rankings, some of the driest fall conditions we'd ever experienced, and also some of the very warmest fall conditions we'd ever experienced. And that's a really good ingredient. Those are really good ingredients for fire, but there may have been just enough moisture in the root systems to prevent major forest fires, at least in some of the northern forests. Of course, in parts of North Dakota, there were major fires in September, but not so much in October in the region. But there were agricultural fires, especially, and even during harvest, there were quite a few, some incidental, and a lot of combine fires. And that's just a testimonial to the very dry conditions, warm and dry conditions that really dominated the region during the harvest. And we've also seen Great Lakes temperatures that were about 5 degrees, sorry, I should have said 5 degrees Fahrenheit on average above the normal temperature for this time of year. So that's, there's a little variation around the lakes, but it's been a warm period. And all that warming led to some unusually warm water conditions in the Great Lakes. And if you think about what this means, well, if you have warm water, the energy associated with the warm water not only extends the open water season, but in a lot of the lake areas, downwind of those lakes, when a cold wind blows across a warm lake, that's one of the ingredients you have for lake effect snow. And so if you've got more open water extending later into the fall and into the winter, deeper into the winter, or with less chance of freezing over, then that actually would enhance the lake effect snow potential. Also, the warmth of the water, the temperature of the water, has some positive correlation with the intensity of lake effect snow. So if lakes are warmer, they're going to tend to produce stronger convection over the lakes, which could lead to heavier bands of lake effect snow if the other conditions leading to that kind of snow are 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 in place. One thing I didn't put in here, it's worth mentioning, there are harmful algal blooms on some of the Great Lakes, Lake Erie, for example. Activity wasn't unusually high, but it was, a bit high, as we heard from some of our colleagues in the Great Lakes region. That season has effectively ended now as the cooler conditions have moved in, but because we had a long and warm kind of open season, warm season, began early and it ended late. It was above normal, above average activity. And another thing that was above average and kind of odd that hasn't necessarily been observed a lot was active fall vegetation throughout the region. So after harvest, you'd see signs of some plants reemerging. We saw a lot of gardeners seeing flowers budding. There's a picture from Indiana of a rose. We had some reports of lilacs getting at least second leaf here in Minnesota, which is quite unusual. Not a lot of reported instances of that occurring that we know of, and some of the naturalists and phenologists kind of baffled by this. So it was, the sorts of impacts that you would expect from a predominantly dry and warm fall season. Going into the drought situation. So, generally the wet conditions in the last few weeks have helped ease the drought, but because we were so dry and so warm during September and October, there was actually a lot of drought that developed over the region. Some of it had already been ongoing and pretty severe already, or pretty intense already. But in general, the wetter conditions, not everywhere, but in many areas have helped ease some of the drought. But we'll take a look at that more closely. So, looking at the most recent drought monitor, you see a lot of drought in the region. Virtually every state in the region is affected by some level of drought, at least moderate drought everywhere in the region. And you see those reds, so you see pockets of extreme, that D3, and even exceptional drought in parts of Ohio and Montana. So we do have a lot of drought in the region, but it's worth looking at the evolution of this. And you can even see from the table here the way that things have changed. So that D3, D4 category over on kind of the right side of the table shows that the proportion of those kind of high-end drought categories has actually increased a little bit from last week. But there have been some drops in the other categories. The D2 and the D1 categories have dropped a little bit. And that is because, so if we look at how this evolved, basically the map on the left is showing you how the US Drought Monitor classes or categories have changed. And this first one on the left is the period going from early September to late October. So it's an 8-week period. And where you see the drought-like colors, those are areas that had a 1, 2, or even a 3-class degradation, meaning they went from one level of drought, or maybe it was abnormally dry, to the next highest level, or in some cases in an 8-week period they advanced 3 levels. So this was a really rapid onset drought. It progressed quickly. It was regional, and it was almost national scale if it weren't for the kinds of the excessive precipitation that we had outside of the region and on the far south end of the region. But we did see a lot of drying on almost a national basis over this 8-week period. So a lot of that drought advancement that we saw was in the 8-week period between September and early September and the end of October, when it was extremely dry and it was also extremely warm. Now, on the right, you have what's happened to the drought categories over the last 3 weeks. So basically from October 29th through November 19th. And here, what you see is that a lot of the region, about half of it, has seen improvement. That does not mean erasing the drought at all. It just means easing, maybe reducing the category by 1 or even 2. So going from, say, severe drought into moderate drought, or maybe going from severe drought into abnormally dry conditions, which aren't even technically drought conditions. So there have been some nice improvements in the region, but you can see it's not uniform. There have continued to be degradations. In other words, worsening of drought conditions in parts of Michigan, eastern Ohio, eastern Kentucky, and then also on the western side of the region in the Dakotas and in Montana. But, if you look at kind of the center, and I'd say the largest pattern that we've seen in the last few weeks is for the wet conditions to begin improving that drought situation. Looking at, on the left, the calculated soil moisture, this is from the Climate Prediction Center. On the left, that is kind of showing the results of some of this precipitation. If we'd looked a month ago or so, we would have had more dry patterns on the maps. But now we see wetter conditions.
Hey,
yes.
We're going to need to pick it up just a little bit and
sure. Okay.
start breezing some of this stuff.
Sure. Okay.
Thank you.
Yep. And the soil moisture on the right, that's from the Lamberton Outreach Station in Minnesota. And what it shows, honestly, the black line is just average soil moisture. You can see that since mid-September, we've been low. We've made some gains, but we're still in deficit. This doesn't include recent heavy precipitation. Let's get into the outlooks. So the 8 to 14-day period that's a change. Cooler than normal conditions are outlooked. So this goes from November 28th, so that's Thanksgiving, into December 4th. The entire region looks cool, or at least is leaning cool on the current outlooks. And western and eastern parts of the region are looking wet. That corresponds to kind of an active pattern, keeping cool weather in place. This isn't unusually cold air by any stretch of the imagination. It's just really the first time we've had truly cold air in the region, or cool to cold air.
And maybe, Kenny, we should also say that there is a hazard outlook for that time period.
Sure. Yeah.
A little bit about the cold in the far north.
Yeah.
You might say something about that.
Yeah, that's true. The Climate Prediction Center also does put together some hazard projections, and the chances, in North Dakota for much below normal temperatures are the highest. There's also chances for snow, lake effect snow, especially around the Great Lakes region. And then, of course, in the mountainous areas in Colorado, Wyoming, and Montana. Some of those areas are going to probably see heavy snow because we've got a lot of weather systems moving through the region. Decent amount of precipitation. The best chance for heavy precipitation is on the eastern side of the region, kind of Ohio, Kentucky. And as you saw from the drought map, they need it there. And then also with this, it could be quite a windy period. Again, that's that week, kind of end of November, beginning of December, where if we do have these strong low pressure systems, often they get cranked up right around the Great Lakes area. They produce a strong pressure gradient and a lot of wind. The December outlook for much of the region shows kind of equal chances of warmer or cooler conditions. So you have to get into southern Kansas, southern Missouri, and Kentucky, and I guess Colorado, really, before you see the best chances of warm conditions. And almost the entire region for December is outlooked to have equal chances for above or below normal precipitation. Now, this doesn't mean it's going to be normal precipitation. Just a reminder, it just means that there's nothing decisively tilting the odds one way or the other, with the exception of in western Montana, where there's a bullseye of above, kind of higher probabilities of above normal precipitation during December. When you look at the winter in general, this now reflects kind of a La Niña pattern, showing cooler than normal conditions outlooked between December and February, especially in the northern tier. Different story on the eastern side of the region, from Michigan down through Ohio, Indiana, and Kentucky, where it looks like better chances for having kind of a warm winter. And then above normal precipitation over the Great Lakes region is outlooked. Doesn't mean it's guaranteed to occur. It just means the indications are greater than equal probabilities of being wet. And that's also true again over Montana and northern Wyoming. Just to kind of put all of this is a bar graph that shows how the Climate Prediction Center is looking at the odds of having La Nina or neutral conditions or El Nino. And these current probabilities are a little bit lower than they were with the last outlook, but they are still indicating, and these are 3-month periods, so they're 3 full months, and then they advance 1 month at a time. And it's expected that for the period centered on December, so that's from now through January, basically, and then from December through February, that period will probably see a La Nina develop. It's a cooling of the Pacific Ocean near the equator, and it's kind of linked to the sorts of patterns that we saw on that seasonal outlook map. There are other things that the forecasters take into consideration, but La Nina and El Nino can be a big driver. Again, the probabilities have come down slightly. The timing has shifted a little bit later in terms of the onset, but the overall thinking is that La Nina, probably a weakish one, will develop here, over the coming 1 to 3 months. And the seasonal drought outlook is, this shows kind of the tendency for drought, and this is through February. And again, this is based on similar information available to the forecasters. And it does show that the dry areas in the kind of western part of the region are probably likely to continue with drought. It's the dry season here. We don't get a lot of precipitation, so it's kind of hard to move out of drought categories without a lot of, a big surge of moisture. But you do see that the central and eastern parts of the region either have no drought already or are expected to have that drought area removed. That's just based on current conditions and some of the information available to the forecasters. It's not guaranteed that this pattern will be exactly what happens. All right, so that ends the presentation. Contact information for the real brains behind this mission is everyone after my name. And if you have questions that are going to be on the scope of this discussion, a lot of these folks would be happy to answer them. Thank you very much.
All right. Hey, thank you, Kenny. That was a great talk. You covered a lot of stuff as usual. We can't cover it all, unfortunately, but we only got so much time, and climate happens or weather happens, so we do what we can. I do want to touch on a couple things because I'm sure we don't have any questions per se that I can see anyway in the question box, but I did want to touch on a couple things, and I want to turn it over to Dennis for just a moment to talk a little bit more about ag impacts and stuff related to that. So the first thing I wanted to pose was, why was it so warm and dry during we often get this question, why was it so warm and dry, or why did it turn that way, stay that way in some cases, after August into September and October? And basically the answer is sort of, we were stuck in a pattern that didn't change. We were sort of blocked or locked into a pattern, and we were totally cut off from the Gulf of Mexico. The Gulf of Mexico does provide incredible amount of moisture to us, which it did start in late October and through November. So that's where you're seeing all that rain come from. And if either Kenny or Dennis want to expand on why was it so warm and dry, please do.
I'll see what Dennis wants to say, and then I'll maybe clean up anything, add in anything that might need to be said.
I mean, Doug had it mostly right. There was a big ridge of high pressure that was kind of parked over basically a good chunk of the eastern 2/3 of the U.S. And the only places that got much moisture was Florida with tropical systems and a little bit in the Four Corners area of the Southwest. Otherwise, it was pretty dry and high pressures to push the atmosphere down, which tends to warm it a bit more.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And one of the things that was kind of an outstanding feature of this ridge was how totally suppressive it was to precipitating weather systems that are normally part of the west to east flow of things across this part of the world. We just, not only did our weather systems not have moisture available to them, but there really weren't very many weather systems, we would sometimes, parts of the region would go weeks without a substantial temperature change. Even as we were getting, late into September, when you usually start cooling down, or into October. So it was a pretty thorough cutoff of all opportunities to have precipitation, unless you're in the area that can get tropical moisture, as Dennis said.
So if you're under weeks of blue sky, you can pretty much be guaranteed that you're under a high pressure system. That's what we're talking about. If you're under a lot of clouds and often wind or whatever, it can also sort of indicate low pressure. The other thing I'll say is I think Austin showed a map sort of relating the amount of sunshine, or the amount of, I shouldn't say sunshine, I should say cloudlessness there was during that period. And it was, I think, considered record cloudlessness during that period for some portions of the region. The other thing I wanted to touch on was going back to La Nina just for a moment. If you look at some of the composites for snow for a weaker version of La Nina, which we certainly are seeing, by the way, this is not a gangbuster, what do they call it the last few times, a Godzilla La Nina or anything like that. It's very weak, if it even happens at all. We often see an increase in snow, more or less from the Rockies to the Great Lakes, so the north central part of the U.S. That's not a prediction. That is just a correlation that we've seen in the past. So I wanted to bring that up, and I think that's all I wanted to say. And Dennis, I'm going to turn it over to you for sort of more of an Aggie comment thing. Or anything else?
Sure. Yeah, from an ag standpoint, yeah, and if you have any questions, you can still enter them and we can still address them. Just a couple ag things going on. We are late, past the main part of the growing season. So the things we're monitoring right now, the return to some precipitation has helped start to recharge soil moisture, because as Kenny talked about, there was large area with a lack of precipitation. Soils are typically drier in the fall anyway, and we start to get some soil moisture recharge. The dry early fall was limiting that recharge, so we have started to put more moisture back in the soils, but we still have a long way to go in some places, and still more, and even the places that receive some will still need more as we go through the winter and the spring. The rainfall also has probably helped pasture and range conditions, though those are not reported by USDA NASS at this point in the season. What is still reported by USDA NASS is winter wheat conditions, and winter wheat conditions which were on the low end of, like the last 15 years, some of the lowest in the last 15 years for this time of year, have bounced back now to kind of mid-range. Not outstanding, but very middle of the road. So that's a definite improvement that the precipitation has brought. Because of the warmth, our soils have also stayed relatively warm overall. That's probably been a bad thing for people who do any fall nitrogen application, but it has kept them from freezing, and since they haven't frozen, the rainfall has been able to get moisture back in the soils. The only place I'm finding some frozen soils now are maybe up in the Dakotas, where we've been cold enough for long enough to get some soil freezing.
There was a question about precipitation and fires in New Jersey, and here it is. Here we usually show this. I didn't catch it in time to get Kenny to throw it in there at the last moment, but this is the 7-day accumulated, 7 days, next 7 days, accumulated precipitation for the nation. Obviously, I'll start with our region. You can see a big hole over South Dakota and, sorry, Kenny, your backyard in Minnesota. But if you look to New Jersey, right, you do see some good chance, or a decent chance, of some rain, maybe 1/4 of an inch to an inch in some places. I'm not exactly sure where those fires are, but the whole East Coast looks wetter during this 7-day period. So I hope that answers your question, Sheldon. Dennis, did you want to say anything about wheat?
I did.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I said while you were pulling that up, I did mention wheat already.
Okay,
Yep.
okay. Sorry about that. And the other thing I wanted to show really quick, just because people may be traveling, although we are not a weather crew here. We're more of a climate crew. These are the hazards for the nation. And if you look at temperature, this is as of I want to make sure I'm right. It's yesterday, yeah. So the hazards more or less show that pretty darn cold temperatures across the north in terms of, we're calling these anomalously cold, like 10 below zero. Precipitation-wise, slight chance of above normal, or a lot above normal in terms of precipitation along that area, sort of the lower Ohio basin and lower Mississippi. In terms of snow, Kenny mentioned the open waters, and with cold air blowing across them, you should expect a lot of lake effect snow, and then a lot of wind during this period as well. I believe the 6 to 10 day outlook shows a lot more emphasis on the cold, especially up in Montana and North Dakota, and kind of a wetter signal across the region. Again, this is days 6 to 10, and this is from yesterday. This will be updated probably in the next hour, to be honest with you. Yeah, if you want to look at that, you can go to CPC and type CPC into your browser and look at those.
Yeah. And just to clarify what Doug's saying, for folks in Montana and North Dakota, it would be cold for this time of year. Yeah. They wouldn't. They're not. These are hardy folks. They're not going to think it's all that cold. It's just cold for late November. And
I think they're still not going to like 10 below, no matter what. But the other thing is, we haven't had these cold air outbreaks. We've had a couple, what do you want to call them? Cool days. But people are walking in to the office over the last 2 months saying, oh, it's a little cold out there. No, it's not cold. It's still 10 to 15 to 20 degrees above normal today. So what are you talking about? Get ready. Winter is coming. It'll feel colder. All right. Anything else? Anybody?
I'm good here. Thank you, Doug.
And thank you again, Kenny, and thank you, Dennis, for your input. And I think that's going to wrap it up until December 19th, which I'm sure everybody will be worried about the weather then and not about Christmas or buying presents or anything like that. So join us back here, Bridget Mason from the Wisconsin State Climate Office. Thanks, everyone. Have a great week and Thanksgiving. Bye-bye.